Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and a tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video view series where we take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the Warlock class supplements Dramatis Personae, Archfey, Fiends, and Great Old Ones Patrons, designed by Andrés Lillo, aka Azzael Ulbrinter, for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. Several review copies, I should mention. I was reviewing a trilogy of supplements. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Bezo, Wizard, Princess, Christopher, Star, Loverly, and Thomas. Gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos Dade, Vicente, Gilberto, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Slendy, Nick, and Party McButterpants. Thank you all very much for your support. So, for the purposes of this review, I'm going to primarily focus on Dramatis Personae Great Old One Patrons, but I am technically reviewing a series of 3 separate supplements that all have Dramatis Personae : either Archfey Patrons, Fiend Patrons, or Great Old One Patrons. This is should guess right now, a Warlock-based class supplement that expands on the existing features that are in the player's handbook. So the original 3 Warlock Patrons. And I always thought that the otherworldly patrons were the subclasses, but technically they're slightly different than that. It's more like the sorcerer, how the sorcerer has whatever their initial origin of their sorcerer's power is, which can be wild magic or the draconic bloodline. The warlocks have to gain their magic from one of these sources, which is their actual pact magic, and then they'll actually gain a pact boon at 3rd level, which is their actual subclass. So what this does is the former. It expands on the ability. If you'll turn to page 109 in your player's handbook, we will go over them. Warlocks are one of my favorite classes in D&D in 5th edition. The short rest, a few spell slot thing is kind of always tricky to wrap your head around, but I think it's just a really fun thematic idea for a character that kind of sells themselves to a very powerful entity and gains power because of that. I mean, that's kind of a storyline that almost just writes itself. And I love the invocations that you can pick as you level up, and you can kind of really customize your own abilities. And it's a fun little self-class like shopping network where you can choose your invocations as you level up, in addition to being a spellcaster too, which is really nifty. So we're going to focus primarily on the Great Old One Patrons because I thought that was just going to be one of the more interesting ones to look at because everybody loves the Elder God. So to review, before we jump into this, if you turn to page 110 in your player's handbook, Warlocks gain their otherworldly patron abilities at 1st level, 6th level, 10th level, and 14th level. Okay, so they get 4 different abilities. The Great Old One Warlock specifically has the Awakened Mind at 1st level, which allows them to communicate with people telepathically. It's a really fun ability, even though it typically doesn't have much, combat uses, but it's a really fun out-of-combat ability. Or I guess you could talk to people in combat too. At 6th level, you can throw up a shield as a reaction to cause disadvantage, and then if they miss that, you gain advantage on your attack. You can do that once per short rest. At 10th level, you are immune, or you have resistance to psychic damage, and you can reflect psychic damage if it's dealt back to you. And at 14th level, you can charm humanoids who have been incapacitated. I believe once per... Oh no, it just says you can kind of do that whenever. So, but obviously very limited. How often do you incapacitate a humanoid and then need to charm them as they wake up? That's called Create Thrall. So, this doesn't try and necessarily create a whole bunch of new abilities. This is not like a supplement, which I usually review, which are new class, like new subclasses. This isn't really that. It really is like an expansion pack, and DLC, if you will, to the existing patrons. Specifically, obviously, this one's just for Great Old Ones. So, for example, let's see, what's a good example that we can look at? Let's look at let's look at Caius, because that is one of the more familiar, which I didn't realize was necessarily a Great Old One. But this one, there's very few of these that I actually recognize. I'm not, huge into my Forgotten Realms lore, as most of you know. But there are some names that I'm beginning to recognize, and plus just doing reviews over the years, I've learned a lot. The Worm That Walks, which does not have an actual page number when it comes to that. Let's see, I think it's part of... There it is. The Worm That Walks. So I do like the way this is organized and put together. It's got a lot of fun artwork. I believe most of this, if not all of it, is stock art, but I appreciate that there is art on like every page or almost every page of various like crazy powerful creatures, which looks nice. And of course, it uses a very standard template for just 5e material. One thing I love about the Great Old One Patrons supplement specifically is it has really great descriptions. We'll look at some of the other descriptions that I really enjoyed, but really helped me learn more about some of these more outlandish and exotic creatures that sounded like huge, world-devouring entities. I don't know why you would have a warlock in your party that would worship these, why you'd keep them around, but maybe you just like that much power. So, for example, for Caius worshippers specifically, and again, we're still using the Great Old One Patron. It's very similar to when Mordenkainen added Tiefling variants. When Mordenkainen added Tiefling variants, said, okay, you want to be a Tiefling, but you can be a Tiefling of, Asmodeus, or a Tiefling of Levistus, or whatever the different devils were of the different layers of the Abyss. And that gave you basically just slightly different stat changes, as well as access to different spells. So it used the same template and just changed out a few of the things. This is kind of similar, although it goes much further than that and can straight up change a lot of the features to be completely different, but sort of tries to keep it where, a lot of the 14th abilities are creating like summoned creatures, and a 10th level ability is usually some kind of a shield thing, but not necessarily. And a lot of them, which I didn't realize this, in Xanathar's, the new warlocks that were added in Xanathar's, and maybe in Tasha's, I didn't look too closely, add an additional first level feature. So you actually get 2 things at first level. Now, some of those are usually like a combat ability and a non-combat ability, but in the case of the original 3 in the player's handbook, you only have the 1 ability at first level. So all of these that are provided here give you an additional ability at first level. In the case of Caius, you can discorporate, which means you can turn into a pile of worms. I believe as a reaction, or is it as an action? As an action. You can divide yourself into a number of worms up to proficiency bonus. Divide current hit points by the number of worms. Each worm is a number of hit points equal to the result. That's just funny. But a great example of how you can take this very thematic elder god entity, which is this pile of worms and maggots made into a kind of humanoid form, and literally gain that ability. You can talk to maggots at first level also, which again changes slightly your telepathy ability, and a lot of these have that kind of thing. So like one of them has to do with earth. There's like an earth-based entity, the Hulks of Zaretha, and you can communicate with the earth. Another one is a more water ocean one. You can communicate with sea creatures. It just kind of slightly changes those themes. At 14th level for Caius, you can literally create a spawn of Caius, which is nuts. I don't know why you'd want this person in your party, but that is a feature. So none of these are, incredibly different and, a new subclass, but they're not supposed to be. They just take what's already existing and kind of makes it more interesting, which means this is, I think, a good straight upgrade to the player's handbook, because a lot of these, like, why if your DM's allowing you to do these, why would you just take the base option? Because this takes the base option and then gives you more thematically appropriate abilities for whatever creature you want to worship, as well as giving the additional first level feature. In terms of the descriptions that I love, we're going to look at the Atropus, which is aka the World-Born Dead. This thing is, I guess, Galactus. And it is a giant planet, or Unicron, giant planet that devours other planets and just keeps growing and growing. I just love how it describes it as, some scholars believe that for life to exist, there must be death, so Atropus was born as an equalizer to the cosmic balance. Some believe that once Atropus finishes its work and eliminates all life, it will grow so huge it will collapse and destroy itself, unleashing a new wave of life. And some suggest that our universe might not be the current one. Others suggest that just as birds lay eggs, gods are born from planetoids. Maybe Atropus was the last god created and hasn't been hatched yet, part of a natural cycle that will eventually hatch into a god. Like, those are all just really cool theories and ideas as part of this description to this entity that I had no idea anything about. Another one I loved was the Hulks of Zaretha. This is the one that has all the earth-based powers, and these are huge, 20-foot tall, humanoid-shaped monoliths that are in the Underdark somewhere and feed, whispers and madness inducing. All this shit's about, whispering to people and causing madness and things. There's one sort. Let's see. One sort of information that is treasured by the scholars of Scrolls of Zaretha. They're written in ancient times by a dwarf. Accidentally found the Hulks. Wrote a series of scrolls. The Hulks are currently waiting for the invasion, and is prophesied that when the time comes, the monoliths will activate and destroy all life on the planet, leaving it ready for the arrival of their creators. They're like a vanguard of some invading alien race, which is also just a really cool description. This one, and I did look through all three of them. I'm just focusing my review on the Great Old One patrons. This one in particular has the best descriptions of all the ones I have read. So unfortunately, not all of them are very good. And that might be the point behind that might be that the devils and demons are more well known, and maybe they don't need all these descriptions. I would have liked if they had given this much love and attention in terms of those descriptions to all of the different creatures, and as well as the Archfey itself. But I really did like how well written and just interesting all of those features are really, really interesting. And then for the other ability I really liked, the Chained God, also known as Tharizdun, which I think I recognize that name as well, who was in ancient times and actually ended up creating the Abyss, and it has all about the madness. And this just has a really cool way of using and inflicting madness on creatures and on yourself. So as a bonus action, you can force a creature to make a wisdom save against your Warlock spell save DC, or suffer a very specific madness from this D6 table, which is very, very debilitating. It is either incapacitating or stunning or paralyzing, or even causing them to attack one of their allies. You can do that as a bonus action at 1st level, and then at 10th level you can use that as, in addition to your resistant psychic damage thought shield. If somebody tries to target you with a mental ability or telepathy or something, then you can force that same save and possibly inflict their madness. And I really love at 14th level, as a bonus action, you can just gain a spell slot from 1st to 5th level, but as a result, you then have to suffer one of these madness features. That's a really fun, like, risk reward that I love to give players, because they will absolutely take that risk when the time comes, and that's a really fun way to do it. I would prefer if they had actually rolled on the table rather than choosing, depending on the spell slot, like that's the severity of the ability you get, just because I like the more randomness to it. I think that's more in keeping with D&D, but still, I like the way that uses the different madness themes of Tharizdun, into creating just a more thematically interesting Great Old One patron. We can look a little bit at the other ones as well. So we've got Dramatis Personae Archfey, which is something that, we're still all waiting for a nice, like, Shadowfell, themed adventure. I think it's very lacking. In this case, it divides it up between, like, the Summer Court, the Winter Court, any creatures that don't have a court, the Seelie, Unseelie, all that. I was thinking, like, going through this, like, could I, like, if I wanted, like, for example, for the upcoming Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign, if somebody wanted to literally have Auriel as the Frostmaiden as a patron, how could I work that out? And you could do that in a number of different ways, and I think the actual Winter Court might not be a bad way to do that. There's one called the Prince of Frost, gives you extra, freezing abilities, and it takes the abilities that, again, the Archfey gets, which is like being able to do the Misty Escape, being able to charm and beguile enemies within a 10-foot cube, and it grants a lot of cold powers on top of that and kind of themes it that way. So that would be a pretty appropriate way to do that. You just take the Archfey, and then you take the Prince of Frost as kind of an additional, expansion on top of that. So pretty effective. Probably the most familiar one, the most popular one, and the one that is, I imagine, going to get the most amount of mileage is the Fiend Patrons, Dramatis Personae, because this is the one that everybody's going to recognize. First of all, the Fiend Warlock is a very powerful warlock. It's got really great abilities built in. They pretty much all have to do with combat or protection. And just, you get resistance. You can add, to skill checks. You can get temporary hit points. You've got that awesome Hurtle Through Hell ability where you just a shit ton of damage, and as you punch people through like portals to hell. And this just wraps different, themed enemies on top of that, which are very familiar to Forgotten Realms people. You got Mephistopheles, you've got Zariel, Mammon, Orcus, Jubilex, Levistus, Grotz, all those different devils and demons, and even some Yugoloths in there. So I think that one is probably the one that you're going to get the most amount of mileage out of. But as you can see, not quite as good as the flavor text as Great Old Ones, with like Orcus and Jubilex. You get a little bit here and there, but I mean, you'll probably get more from reading like Out of the Abyss or something. So I wish there was a few more paragraphs that kind of went into their lore a bit better. And I do wish maybe we had gotten some more interesting art rather than just nothing but stock art. But I think the art that is used here is good, and it looks, to me, this is all just good enough. Like, it's fine. It's not enough to necessarily get a big pro or con out of me, which is just kind of a nod, a confident nod of okay, yes. I do like Grotz is the hedonist demon, and a lot of his abilities are like if you take damage, then you get to do other things because you kind of like the damage. So you spread it around, and you get this the whole almost sadomasochism thing, which is a fun way of doing it. So I think all three of these are really, really good. You can get all three of them together in what I believe is called the Bewitching Trilogy, if you wanted to gain all three of them, or if you just specifically had, you know, one Warlock idea in mind, then you can just get one of the three. But in terms of their quality and the kind of abilities you're going to get, I would confidently recommend all three of them together. I think they're all pretty much sharing of the same general quality, and frankly, it's just a straight upgrade to the player's handbook. I think because it takes the stuff that's already here, kind of rebalances them, knowing that, you know, the stuff from Xanathar's adds additional first level features, so this does that, and it gives you more thematically appropriate abilities, so you can pretty much exactly like Mordenkainen's with the tieflings, is you just can gain that much more flavor from your character by being more specific with those abilities. All right, pros and cons. Pro, over 50 expanded Warlock patrons between all three products. Really awesome, and I would recommend all three, as I said. And pro, interesting and informative lore and descriptions for each of these entries, I think is fun. I mean, Great Old One's still the most interesting one. Maybe just because they're the ones I knew the least about, but also I just think they had a lot of cool stories and they were just more written. I mean, some of these are nearly half a page long, which is really fun to see and impressive. And pro, just thematically fun and interesting abilities for all of these different creatures. They just do a good job of, you know, taking the creatures' concepts and ideas, whether they're like the Eater of Dreams or whatever else, so you've got those kind of abilities, and reflects that into your ability set, while still generally keeping the abilities that are in the base player's handbook too, and only switching things around if they're really appropriate, like, you know, melting into a pile of worms, for example. Cons, I really don't have any cons. Like it sets out to exactly what it wants to do, which is, you know, we're not trying to make new subclasses. We're not trying to reinvent any kind of Warlock stuff. We're just taking the three otherworldly patrons that already exist in the player's handbook and create those variants is probably the better term for it, because I think that's the term for the Mordenkainen tieflings as well. And just create multiple variants for each one that allow you to be more specific. And that leads into our final verdict. The Dramatis Personae series expands Warlock patrons with more detailed and thematic choices, creating a welcome expansion to the otherworldly patrons of the player's handbook. Thank you to everyone for watching this written review. You can see my video review, my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.